The first monument to change the shape of human memory rises quietly from the desert, a stepped silhouette older than most written histories. It is the Pyramid of Djoser, not yet the smooth, monumental triangle we picture, but the first colossal statement in stone, a daring experiment in architecture and power that appeared on the Saqqara Plateau in the 3rd millennium BCE. This film asks a simple, urgent question: who were the hands that carved eternity? For too long, the story belongs to kings and myths. A ruler named Djoser and a shadowy genius called Imhotep are woven into the record. But beneath their names lie countless lives of quarrymen, masons, bakers, and foremen whose daily labor made the first pyramid possible. We will follow stone, rope, and sweat to discover the human architects of history. Our journey begins not in the royal court, but at the work site. Workshops ringing with the sound of copper chisels, bakeries supplying the crew, and long rows of mud brick dwellings where skilled laborers lived and were buried, a community as organized and capable as any ancient city. These discoveries overturn old myths about forced labor and reveal pride, skill, and ritual behind the building of a tomb that became a prototype for the world's later pyramids. Stay with us. Over the next episodes, we will move from idea to quarry, from blueprint to burden, and from the named genius to the unnamed hands. If this whisper from the stones calls to you, subscribe and press like, and tell us in the comments, whose story do you want uncovered next?
Long before the silhouette of the smooth-sided pyramid became the shorthand for ancient Egypt, burial architecture spoke in the quieter language of mud brick, the mastaba. These low, rectangular tombs, with their flat roofs and sloping sides, were the standard funerary house for elite families in the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods. Built from readily available mud brick and sometimes faced with stone, mastabas held simple chapels, offering shafts, and underground burial chambers. They were functional, intimate, and deeply tied to local beliefs about provisioning the dead for the afterlife. The mastaba's form encoded priorities: a stable, protected space for offerings, a visible marker in the landscape to keep a name alive, and an architecture that fit the social scale of early polities. But by the late early dynastic period, the pressure of ideology and power began to reshape that scale. As kings consolidated authority around Memphis and claimed new roles as divine intermediaries, tombs ceased to be merely private houses for the dead. They became instruments of statecraft, visible, monumental statements that bound people to a ruler and a cosmic order. This shift created the intellectual soil for a truly radical idea: build not a house for one afterlife, but a tower of stone that anchored a king's eternity in the landscape itself. That intellectual leap was not sudden, it was cumulative. Archaeological layers at Saqqara and other necropolises show several phases where mastabas were enlarged, recut, or rebuilt. In some cases, earlier mastabas were encased within later larger structures, a tangible archaeological trace of changing ambition. Rather than discard the old, early architects experimented. Add a chapel, raise the profile, thicken the walls, then stack. Over decades, this iterative practice moved from adaptation to invention. The idea of verticality, of climbing toward the sky as an architectural metaphor for transcendence, took hold in a practical, material way. The man credited with turning those experiments into a coherent, realized monument was Imhotep, a figure who stands at the intersection of craft, religion, and administration. Serving as chancellor and high priest to King Djoser in Egypt's 3rd dynasty, Imhotep is described in later sources as a polymath, physician, priest, and master builder. It is to him that antiquity and modern scholarship generally ascribed the conception and direction of what came to be called the step pyramid at Saqqara, an architectural solution that built upward by stacking mastaba-like layers and then uniting them within a vast mortuary complex. This was not merely a tomb. It was a planned ritual landscape, complete with courtyards, temples, and processional ways. The step pyramid's phases are important because they show how an idea matured through construction. Excavations have documented multiple stages: early mastaba forms, what archaeologists label M1 through M3, followed by successive accretions that transform the structure into a stepped form, P1 through P2. Each phase involved different masonry techniques, from horizontal bedding of blocks to inclined accretion layers, then to careful casing with fine Tura limestone. These technical shifts speak to an evolving mastery of material and to on-the-ground problem-solving, engineers and masons learning, testing, and refining methods as the monument rose. The pyramid, therefore, is both blueprint and laboratory, an architecture of thought made visible in stone. But ideas do not arise in a vacuum. The move toward monumental stone required institutional change. Building in limestone at a scale never before attempted demanded resources, supply chains, and labor organization on a scale beyond a single household. Quarrying, transporting, dressing, and placing stone meant new logistics. Boats on the Nile to move quarried blocks, teams of masons trained in stonework, stores of food to feed workers during intensive campaigns, and administrative records to marshal materials and people. The Pyramid Project, therefore, marks a widening of state capacity, a centralized ability to direct both material wealth and human effort toward a long-term, non-productive enterprise, the securing of a king's afterlife.
At Saqqara, the evidence for that wider system becomes visible beyond the pyramid itself. The surrounding complex includes workshops, cult structures, and paved courts that would have staged rituals and sustained large cadres of specialists. Archaeological work in and around major pyramid sites has also revealed settlements associated with labor, bakeries, breweries, tools, and burials for workers. Clues that building such monuments depended on organized communities, not a nameless horde. These were skilled people, carpenters, stone cutters, rope makers, and sculptors who practiced trades that were vital for the project's success. The step pyramid, then, began as a royal ambition, but was realized by a complex social machine of craftsmen and administrators. To grasp the significance of the pyramid's birth, we should consider the Nile's rhythm. Seasonal inundation structured agricultural labor, months when fields lay underwater and farmers were available for other tasks. The state exploited this cycle, organizing workers into building seasons when manpower could be mobilized for monumental projects. In effect, the economy of the river made large-scale construction feasible. The social contract between king and people included seasons of labor that reinforced political hierarchy while providing sustenance and wages for workers. This seasonal mobilization underpinned the capacity to move tens of thousands of tons of stone across the landscape over decades. Yet the move from mud brick to stone was also a conceptual pivot about permanence. Mud brick erodes, stone endures. Choosing limestone as the primary material was a statement about memory. It was an architectural decision shaped by belief. The king's body and name needed a durable home for the Ka, the life force that required offerings and recognition to continue. By embedding the tomb in stone, the state sought an architecture of eternity, a physical anchor for religious practice and political legitimacy that would outlast seasons, kings, and even dynasties. The material choice therefore had theological, political, and social consequences. But this pivot raised new technical problems. Stone behaves differently from mud brick. It is heavier, it fractures, it requires different tools and methods to shape. Architects experimented with support methods, bonding mortars, and casing techniques to ensure stability. One of the most revealing aspects of the step pyramid's construction is how it preserves evidence of trial and correction. Infill layers, packing between casing and core, and adjustments to inclination. Rather than a single master plan executed without error, The monument shows iterative engineering, a real-world conversation between design and failure in which builders learned from setbacks and adapted their craft. This problem-solving mindset required institutional records, a hierarchy of supervision, and skilled foremen who could translate royal intent into practical steps on the ground. The labor was neither anonymous nor entirely coercive. Rather, texts and archaeology indicate organized teams, specialist titles, and provisioning systems. In later pyramid building episodes, inscriptions, accounting fragments, and burial markers further confirm this hierarchical structure. While Saqqara's textual record is sparse compared to later sites, the material remains, from tool marks to workers' graves, provide a tangible archive of organization and expertise. The birth of the pyramid idea thus reads as a convergence. Cultural beliefs about the afterlife, political centralization around Memphis, seasonal economic rhythms, and the ingenuity of architects like Imhotep, who translated ritual need into built form. It was an idea born of faith and power, but realized by craft and community. This is the moment where architecture stops being merely shelter for the dead and begins to become a civic project, an act that required planning, provisioning, and the steady hands of thousands. In understanding that convergence, we also begin to see the human cost and human achievement entwined in stone. The step pyramid didn't appear overnight. It was the result of decades of refinement in material technique and social coordination. Its presence on the Saqqara plain is the visible outcome of countless invisible decisions. Which quarry to open, how to ration bread to a crew, how to train an apprentice to dress a block. These mundane choices, repeated thousands of times, add up to what looks grand and inevitable from a distance. Up close, the pyramid is an accumulation of care, skilled labor held together by administrative will. Finally, the transition from mastaba to step pyramid reframes how we speak about ancient innovation. The step pyramid was not an isolated flash of genius, but the maturation of long social experiments in architecture and statecraft. It tells us that monumental change is often incremental, that experiments in stone can encode social transformations, and that the greatest inventions often depend on networks of people whose names seldom enter the record. As we move deeper into this story, we will follow the material trail, from quarries to workshops, from designs to labor camps, to illuminate the practical world that made an idea permanent.
In the story of the step pyramid, one name rises again and again: Imhotep. He is the hand most often credited with translating a royal dream into stone, the chancellor, priest, and court official who stood at the junction of ritual, administration, and craft. Yet Imhotep's historical footprint is curiously faint. Contemporary records from the Third Dynasty are sparse, and much of what later antiquity said about him was layered on across centuries. Still, the attribution of the step pyramid's design to Imhotep is widely accepted in modern scholarship as the best interpretation of surviving evidence and later tradition. To speak of Imhotep is to hold two realities at once. First, there is the man within the living Third Dynasty court of King Djoser, an official whose titles and surviving inscriptions include chancellor or vizier and priestly roles that tied him to the religious life of Memphis. Second, there is the later figure cultivated by memory, Imhotep the sage, physician, and eventually a deified healer in the late period and Greco-Roman eras. Our task is to separate the careful grain of historical fact from the later varnish of legend, and to understand how a skilled courtier could have become the architect of an architectural revolution. The historical Imhotep likely lived in the late 27th or early 26th century BCE, the time of Djoser's reign, when Memphis consolidated power and the state gathered resources for new forms of royal commemoration. The step pyramid complex, built at Saqqara, marks a decisive departure. A mastaba, enlarged and reimagined into a multi-tiered stone structure that required unprecedented planning and coordination.
The shift demanded more than aesthetic daring. It required an administrator who could marshal quarrying, skilled labor, logistics, religious protocol, and the artisanship of 1,000 hands. In that practical sense, Imhotep's role, chancellor and master builder, would have been indispensable. But why does the image of Imhotep the architect hold such power? Part of the reason is scale. The step pyramid and its mortuary complex were not single monuments, but entire ritual landscapes. Courtyards, chapels, ceremonial causeways, and fortified enclosure walls. Turning an extended program of ritual architecture into coherent form required a singular vision and the ability to translate ideology into engineering. Ancient and modern commentators alike read Imhotep into that role, because the scale and novelty of the project implies centralized design leadership, precisely the responsibilities an elite official like a vizier would hold. Archaeological work at Saqqara reveals a monument built in stages, a slow accretion from mastaba to multi-stepped tower, and that phased process fits well with the duties of a sophisticated court office. Jean-Philippe Lauer's long excavations documented construction phases known to archaeologists as M1 to M3 mastaba phases and P1 to P2 pyramid phases. These stages show changing masonry techniques and evolving building solutions, from horizontal courses of limestone to more ambitious casing and inclination. Such gradualism suggests not one impulsive act, but planned experimentation under administrative oversight. A figure who coordinated long-term campaigns, negotiated supply on the Nile, and adjusted plans as techniques matured would naturally emerge at the center of that story. But the historical record remains judiciously sparse. Only a handful of inscriptions from Imhotep's lifetime mention his name directly, and none of those are an architect's blueprint. The earliest clear references to Imhotep as a sage or miracle worker appear many centuries later. This gap has led some scholars to caution against uncritical hero worship. Imhotep's later elevation into a demigod of wisdom and medicine reflects the way memory reshapes ordinary excellence into myth. Still, the combination of administrative titles, proximity to Djoser, and later tradition yields a historically plausible case that he provided intellectual and managerial leadership for the project. What did such leadership mean in practice? An architect in ancient Egypt was not merely a designer sketching forms in isolation. He was an organizer of knowledge, an expert in materials, ritual geometry, logistics, and symbolic program. Imhotep would have needed to coordinate quarrying parties to cut fine Tura limestone for casing, manage teams that transported blocks on barges down the Nile, and oversee groups that shaped core blocks and set masonry courses. The role married priestly knowledge of ritual with bureaucratic skill.
The step pyramid itself preserves traces of that translation between idea and action. Its layered construction shows corrections and adaptations, infill cores, packing between outer casing and inner blocks, and evidence of trial and error in inclination and bonding. Far from showing a flawless, single-season execution, the monument looks like a workshop of thinking made permanent, a set of design choices preserved in stone. Those layers are the fingerprints of an administration that tested methods, learned from failure, and iterated toward a stable form. Imhotep, as a senior official, would have been the arbiter of such decisions. The memorial complex around the pyramid reinforces the image of coordinated planning. The enclosure wall with its rhythmic niches, the colonnaded entrance, and the subsidiary chapels were not decorative afterthoughts. They functioned as part of the mortuary cult that made the king's afterlife an ongoing public concern. Imhotep's responsibilities thus extended beyond structural engineering. They required designing spaces that staged religious performance, channeled crowds, and maintained the sanctity of ritual acts. The architecture both enclosed and revealed the king's presence to the living, binding the community to a systematic expression of kingship. How did Imhotep's intellectual authority relate to the craftspeople who built the monument? The relationship was collaborative and hierarchical.
Master masons, carpenters, rope makers, and quarrymen possessed hands-on knowledge that central planning could not replace. They knew how stones split, how ropes frayed under load, and how seasonal floods altered transport. Imhotep's genius, therefore, should be understood as managerial and creative rather than purely technical. He synthesized craftsmen's know-how into a program and mediated between ritual prescription and material possibility. In that synthesis, Imhotep functioned as both conductor and translator. The later life of Imhotep's reputation adds a striking coda to his historical image. Over a span of some 3 millennia after the Third Dynasty, Imhotep's memory grew. He was invoked as a healer, author of wisdom literature, and finally deified as a god associated with medicine and healing. By the late period and Greco-Roman times, he was equated with Asclepius, the Greek god of healing, and received cultic veneration. This progressive elevation tells us as much about Egyptian memory culture as it does about Imhotep himself. Exemplary administrators could be transformed into figures of cosmic authority by later generations seeking models of wisdom. Yet historians carefully separate that accretion from the practical Imhotep who managed construction under Djoser. To appreciate Imhotep's genius, then, is to hold tension. He is at once an historical actor anchored in the Third Dynasty's administrative needs and a cultural mirror reflecting later generations' desire to personify excellence. The Step Pyramid's novelty demanded a leader who could think across disciplines: ritual, engineering, procurement, and human logistics, and Imhotep's recorded titles and later reputation mark him as the likeliest candidate. Even where direct textual proof is missing, the archaeological and institutional context make the attribution credible within the bounds of academic consensus. There is another important facet to Imhotep's genius: his role as a cultural innovator who recast architectural language. The Step Pyramid is often described as a translation of architectural forms from perishable materials, reed, wood, and mud brick, into enduring stone. That translation required a conceptual leap to preserve the symbolic vocabulary of domestic and palatial architecture in a medium that could last centuries. Imhotep's design choices, stacked mastaba-like volumes, false doors, and facades that mimic wooden beams, are not mere aesthetic gestures. They are deliberate acts that encode memory into a new, durable grammar. By choosing stone, Imhotep and Djoser created an architectural rhetoric of permanence that subsequent rulers would adopt and refine. Finally, the story of Imhotep teaches us about the nature of innovation in ancient societies. Monumental breakthroughs are rarely the product of solitary genius in isolation. They depend on institutional capacity, economic rhythms, and skilled communities. Imhotep's capacity to harness these elements, to translate ritual theory into a built program, to work within the seasonal economy of the Nile, and to orchestrate craftsmen is where his practical genius lies. He is best seen not as a lone architect conjuring stone, but as a central node in a network of expertise that collectively produced a new architectural world.
The Step Pyramid did not stand alone like a solitary monument. It sat at the heart of a planned ritual city, a compact, functioning world of workshops, storerooms, chapels, processional ways, and the everyday architecture that sustained large-scale construction and constant cult performance. This was a living complex dedicated to supporting the dead and the rituals that kept a king's name alive. The scale and variety of spaces around Djoser's tomb show that building a pyramid meant creating an entire environment, a sacred service economy operating year-round. Approach the complex and you enter an enclosure wall punctuated by niches and false doors, an architectural fence that separated the sacred landscape of the mortuary precinct from the ordinary desert beyond. Inside, the Step Pyramid rises from an extended substructure of tunnels and cellars. Around it, a choreography of built spaces, staged rites, stored goods, and housed the people who kept the cult alive. The architecture itself was part ritual theater and part logistical solution, places to present offerings, to rehearse royal ritual, and to shelter specialists who kept the cult's machinery oiled. The evidence for this living city comes first from the archaeology. Paving stones that outline processional routes, depressions in post holes indicating wooden superstructures, workshops littered with debris, and funerary chapels that face the central courts. Jean-Philippe Lauer's long excavation of Saqqara revealed many of these features and documented the phased growth of the complex. What emerges is not merely a static tomb, but a defended and highly organized compound intended to function as a perpetual ritual center. The Step Pyramid's enclosure sheltered a program that required both specialists and routine labor. Within the complex were specialized zones that read like departments in a giant workshop. Stone dressing areas sit near the pyramid where masons worked limestone into consistent blocks and casing. Separate courtyards housed sculptors and relief carvers who executed low reliefs used in the underground chambers. Pottery fragments, ovens, and food storage pits identify areas where large numbers of workers were fed, and archaeological assemblages of bread molds and beer vats point to communal provisioning on an industrial scale. These are the material traces of an economy that combined ritual needs with systematic production. Adjacent to the ritual core were structures that showed administrative control. Rooms with mud brick benches and evidence of writing materials suggest spaces for record-keeping and oversight. Although surviving textual records from Djoser's reign are limited, the architecture itself, rooms laid out for supervised work, passages designed for movement of goods, and storage galleries, implies a bureaucratic apparatus able to track resources, assign labor, and sustain campaigns over years and decades. Monumental architecture required monumental administration. The notion of a work site as a temporary camp underestimates what Saqqara reveals. Rather than a transient workforce arriving and leaving, much of the evidence suggests semi-permanent communities of skilled and semi-skilled laborers living in proximity to the pyramid. Nearby burials include individuals interred with the markers and grave goods consistent with craftspeople and foremen. These cemeteries are not the anonymous mass graves of popular imagination. They are organized burial grounds that reflect social identities and local ties to the mortuary complex. The dead here carried occupational marks into their afterlife, just as they had in life. Food production and provisioning were central to sustaining this living city. Archaeologists have found evidence for large-scale bread baking and brewing, ovens, bread molds, and animal bones, indicating organized logistics of feeding hundreds, if not thousands, of workers during peak building seasons. These food economies were not incidental, they were integral to social order. The state could only mobilize manpower reliably if it could provide rations, shelter, and a degree of social stability. In this way, the built environment both relied on and reinforced a civic compact between rulers and laborers. Tools and material culture tell their own story. Copper chisels, dolerite pounding stones, wooden sledges, and rope fragments, replicated in experimental archaeology, make the engineering process visible. The proximity of workshops to the pyramid reduced transport time and increased efficiency in dressing stone and preparing architectural elements. We can imagine teams of masons working close to the monument, overseen by foremen who kept quality consistent and measurements precise. The city around the Step Pyramid was a factory of craft, with a chain of production stretching from quarry to placement. The urban character of the mortuary complex extended to ritual life. The Hebsed court and subsidiary chapels were settings for ceremonies that reaffirmed royal power and the cosmological order. These public rituals were not private royal spectacles.
They required participants, attendants, and specialized performers. As such, the complex functioned as a living theater where social roles were both enacted and reinforced in the presence of stone that spoke of permanence. The architecture choreographed memory and social performance together.
One of the most revealing features of the living city is how artisans and administrators left traces in different strata. Excavations have identified zones where pottery styles shift, where tools cluster, and where repairs to structures indicate long-term habitation and reuse. These material palimpsests show an economy that adapted across years. Spaces reused, repurposed, and maintained. Maintenance itself required labor, skilled knowledge, and an ongoing relationship between living communities and their sacred architecture. The pyramid's permanence thus relied on a living culture of care. Labor organization at Saqqara also reflects broader social rhythms. The Nile's annual inundation created seasonal intervals of slack in agricultural labor when peasants could be mobilized for state projects. This seasonal rhythm was predictable and allowed the state to schedule intense building phases when the fields lay fallow. Archaeological evidence suggests episodic surges of activity, building campaigns concentrated in specific seasons, interspersed with periods of maintenance and ceremonial activity. The living city therefore pulsed with the agricultural calendar, connecting the mythic permanence of stone to the living cycle of the river. Importantly, the living city challenges long-held myths about pyramid labor. The picture painted by the archaeology is one of skilled, provisioned workers, craftsmen and specialists, rather than a faceless, enslaved mass. Workers were housed, fed, and buried with markers that suggest social recognition. In many ways, these communities were professionalized. Knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship, and skills were organized into guild-like groupings. While the social relations could be hierarchical and demanding, they were not uniformly coercive in the simplistic sense popular culture often suggests. The presence of medical care and organized burial further nuanced the social picture. Archaeological studies at other pyramid sites have documented healed bone fractures and evidence of care, which, while better known from later sites, indicate that organized care for workers existed. Even if the direct medical evidence at Saqqara is patchy, the existence of structured housing, food production, and durable burial practices implies a level of social investment in those who served in the mortuary economy. This was not an expendable workforce. It was a social class whose labor carried symbolic value and practical reward. Another human dimension of the living city is gendered labor. While many of the sculptural and masonry tasks were carried out by male craftsmen, evidence from pottery, textiles, and food production points to women's crucial roles in sustaining the complex. Women likely worked as bakers, brewers, potters, and textile producers, roles that were essential to provisioning and the everyday functioning of the community. Their labor, often invisible in monumental reliefs, is tangible in the material remains of domestic production. The mortuary complex also protected symbolic capital. The enclosure's false doors and niched walls created a carefully managed landscape in which access was controlled and sightlines planned. This spatial choreography allowed the living to meet the dead in ritual terms while keeping sacred spaces distinct. The urban plan was a bureaucratic instrument and the sacred theater at once. Entrances, processional ways, and chapels were arranged to manage movement and to reinforce hierarchical visibility. Ritual, administration, and urbanism were inseparable. Artistic production at Saqqara further animated the living city. Reliefs, painted chambers, and statuary done by highly skilled artisans filled the inner sanctums with imagery designed to ensure the king's regenerative power. Sculptors and painters worked in close coordination with architects to translate symbolic programs into durable surfaces. These artists were specialists whose work was central to the complex's meaning. They made the invisible ideology visible, embedding ritual instruction into stone and pigment. The presence of workshops near these production areas indicates a continuous flow from design to execution. We should also notice the interplay between local memory and new monuments. Djoser's decision to build at Saqqara connected his complex to earlier elite burials at the site. This choice anchored a new royal project within an older landscape of memory and precedent, a deliberate act of legitimacy making. The living city, therefore, was both innovative and conservative. It introduced new stone technologies while reusing and reinterpreting earlier mortuary patterns. The urban fabric thus carried layers of history visible to contemporaries and legible to later generations. Archaeology also shows how the living city performed as an economic node in a wider network. Materials such as Tura limestone were quarried elsewhere and shipped on the Nile. Timber and other non-local resources were imported, and artisan skills circulated between sites. The mortuary complex functioned within a supply chain. Quarries, river transport, workshops, and markets all fed into Saqqara's operations. This connected local ritual life to regional economies, and the living city served as a hub where religious purpose met practical commerce. The living city also preserved traces of intimacy and daily detail. Graffiti scratched by hands at work, small votive offerings tucked into crevices, and the wear patterns on thresholds. These small things speak loudly. They reveal the presence of human rhythms, rest and labor, devotion and routine. The step pyramid and its surrounding city were inhabited by people whose daily gestures left marks in ways that archaeological methods can now recover. These fragments reconnect us to the private, repeated actions that made monumental history possible. In sum, the step pyramid's living city was a place where the sacred and the mundane intertwined. It was a service economy, a workshop complex, a ritual theater, and a planned urban enclosure that sustained the technical, logistical, and ceremonial needs of a revolutionary monument. Far from being an isolated stone, the step pyramid was embedded in a human ecosystem. People who ate, slept, worshipped, argued, healed, and buried their dead within sight of the stone they helped to shape. As we leave the living city and step away from its ovens and courts, we carry with us a clearer view of the social engine behind the stone. The pyramid's silhouette is a monument to kingship and to ideology, but its reality depends on communities who lived and worked in its shadow.
To turn an idea into a 100,000-ton monument, you need more than ambition. You need tools, techniques, and a tacit body of craft knowledge passed from hand to hand. The builders of the step pyramid did not have steel, pulleys, or modern cranes. They had copper, stone, wood, rope, ingenuity, and a clear understanding of material behavior. From quarries to quayside, from sledge to setting, each stage used simple implements applied with sophisticated practice. This chapter follows that chain, the real, testable engineering that made the impossible possible. The first instruments were the cutting tools. For soft and medium limestones, the standard toolkit was copper chisels and stone hammers. Copper, when hardened by cold working, can cut limestone effectively. Masons used chisels of varying width for shaping blocks and finer tools for dressing surfaces. For very hard stones, like granite from Aswan, workers used dolerite pounding stones, tough, rounded boulders hauled from igneous outcrops and used as hammer stones to chip and peen surfaces. Experimental archaeology consistently shows these combinations work when employed by skilled hands. The archaeological record at Saqqara and other sites preserves chisel marks and tool debris that match these methods. Quarrying itself was a process of knowledge and patience. In the Nile Valley, masons cut trenches to isolate blocks, then used wooden wedges and levers or battered rock with pounding stones to detach them. For particularly hard seams, ancient quarrymen combined mechanical weakening with heat, fire setting, to crack rock along desired lines, followed by controlled cooling and wedging to split slabs. The evidence for systematic quarry fields across Egypt demonstrates a long tradition of extracting stone with locally adapted techniques rather than brute force alone. Once a block was freed, moving it became the next engineering problem. The ancient solution was deceptively simple: sledges. Massive blocks sat on robust wooden sledges whose runners spread the load and reduced point pressure on the sand. Workers pulled these sledges with thick ropes, bundles of flax or papyrus fiber twisted into durable cords, and foremen coordinated teams using rhythmic calls or musical beats to synchronize effort. Experimental reconstructions show that well-made sledges and coordinated crews could move multi-ton blocks over short distances with surprising efficiency when conditions were optimized. A crucial insight emerged from modern physics and archaeology. Sand behaves differently when lightly moistened. Laboratory experiments have demonstrated that adding a small amount of water to dry sand creates capillary bridges that increase cohesion and reduce sliding friction, a trick that effectively halves the manpower required to pull a sledge in tests. Archaeologists now believe workers deliberately wetted the sand in front of sledges to make hauling heavy stones easier, a technique that would have been especially useful on the desert approach roads to pyramid sites. This combination of empirical observation and experimental validation ties ancient practice to modern understanding. Transport over longer distances depended on the Nile. Heavy or high-quality stone, such as fine Tura limestone for casing or Aswan granite for structural elements, was moved on rivercraft. The recent discovery of the Diary of Merer, a set of Old Kingdom papyri, provides direct evidence that organized teams hauled Tura limestone by boat to pyramid sites during the 4th dynasty. The papyri describe schedules, crews, and round trips between quarries and construction harbors, a documentary window that confirms long-theorized logistic chains of supply. Boats, canals, and seasonal river engineering turned natural geography into a moving conveyor belt for stone. On site, aims shifted from moving to placing. Setting large blocks required systems for leveling, measuring, and securing. Ancient builders used simple but effective surveying tools: plumb bobs to establish verticals, sighting rods and cords for straight lines, and water basins for establishing horizontal planes. These were not abstract instruments, they were practical devices used to maintain orientation and datum across the structure as it rose. The tight tolerances in some casing joints demonstrate that Egyptian surveyors could measure and execute alignment to remarkable precision using these low-tech instruments. Lifting blocks to higher courses has generated more debate, but the archaeological consensus is humble: ramps and inclined planes. For the step pyramid, which rises in discrete steps, builders could combine earthen ramps, timber cribbing, and inclined working platforms to haul stones to each successive level. The structure's construction stages show changes in accretion layers and casing that align with episodic ramping strategies. Builders adapted ramp geometry as the monument grew. While the detailed ramp designs are still discussed among scholars, the general principle, convert vertical work into manageable horizontal pulls, is straightforward and visible in the monument's physical evidence. Timber played a small but crucial role. Egypt's limited native forests made wood a costly commodity, but builders used it intelligently. Sledges and rollers, levers, cribbing, and temporary scaffolding all depended on wooden elements. Where possible, Builders reused timbers and planned operations to minimize waste, an economizing imperative evident from the types and sizes of wood remains found at sites. The scarcity of timber underscores how logistics, not just tools, shaped engineering choices. Stone techniques were honed to reduce dependence on scarce imported materials. Joints and bonding methods mattered. The step pyramid's core shows an economy of packing. Smaller chips and packing material filled gaps between larger blocks, while fine Tura limestone provided a dressed outer casing. Mortars appear in some areas as gypsum-based bedding layers or clay mortars that compensated for imperfect block faces. This pragmatic approach, a load-bearing core of robust blocks with filling and precise outer casing, allowed builders to achieve scale while controlling material and labor costs. The archaeological footprint of packing material and casing remnants records these practical choices. Ropes and knots were the unsung precision tools. The tensile strength of ancient ropes, made from flax or other vegetal fibers, dictated team sizes and hauling strategies. Rope manufacture was itself a specialized craft. Bundles were laid with alternating twist patterns, joined, and kept under tension to test integrity. Ropes were used not only for hauling, but for measuring, stretched for sight lines, and for engineered braking systems when lowering stones down inclines. The simple physics of cordage shaped construction sequences in ways that modern engineers can quantify and replicate. Organization turned tools into systems. Tools do little without a social architecture to deploy them. Survey records, administrative rooms, and storage galleries in the step pyramid complex indicate the presence of foremen, scribes, and provisioning officers who coordinated material supply, labor rosters, and seasonal campaigns. The Mur papyri provide a parallel example of record-keeping for stone transport. At Saqqara, the evidence for storerooms, bakeries, and worker housing shows the on-site logistics that transformed tools into throughput. In short, engineering was embedded in bureaucracy. Experimental archaeology has been invaluable in testing hypotheses about ancient tools. Teams using replica sledges, period-accurate ropes, and reconstructed wooden runners have shown that the ancient methods are practical and that the manpower estimates once offered by sensational accounts were often exaggerated. These recreations demonstrate that a combination of sledges, wet sand, rollers, and coordinated crews can move multi-ton stones with numbers of people that align with archaeological provisioning evidence, the ovens, bread molds, and bones that suggest the scale of labor was compatible with these techniques. The science of materials helps too. Petrographic studies identify stone provenance, Tura limestone for casing, local limestone for core, Aswan granite for heavy load-bearing elements, and these compositions reveal why certain stones were chosen for specific roles. Tura's fine-grained white limestone made elegant casings. Local limestones provided massive cores. Aswan granite supplied durable beams and plugs. Understanding material properties allowed architects to assign each stone a function within the structure, a form of early materials engineering. Even seemingly mundane implements, wooden mallets, copper saws, and polishing abrasives mattered for finish and fit. Fine casing joints depended on abrasives and polishing techniques that created even bearing surfaces. Small tools produced the precision that made the outer face appear seamless. These final acts of craftsmanship were the visible signature of larger systems, the work of masons and finishers translating structural mass into aesthetic statement. We should also acknowledge what the ancients did not have: iron tools, complex gear trains, or industrial adhesives. Their absence did not indicate backwardness, but rather shaped choices. Stone selection, packing strategies, and incremental building were all responses to material limits. The result was a structural logic that relied on geometry, mass, and clever use of available technologies rather than on components that had not yet been invented. In that constraint lay a different kind of engineering creativity. Finally, the tools of the ancients teach us about skills and transmission. Apprentices learn to read stone grain, to sense the right spot for a wedge, to judge moisture for hauling sand, and to tie reliable knots. This embodied know-how circulated in workshops and households, preserved by practice more than by formal texts. The step pyramid's survival is not only a record of tools, but of human intelligence encoded in gesture and habit, a distributed engineering tradition that produced monumental results through incremental mastery. The engineering of the step pyramid is therefore a story of fit-for-purpose instruments, adaptive techniques, and social systems that together solved seemingly impossible problems. Copper and stone chisels shaped the block, dolerite hammers freed it, sledges and wet sand moved it, boats and canals carried it, simple survey tools aligned it, ramps and levers lifted it, and foremen and scribes orchestrated the whole machine. Those are the tools, and behind them stood thousands of skilled hands that turned craft into architecture. As we leave the tools themselves and prepare to follow the people who used them, remember this: engineering is a conversation between material and mind. The ancients listened closely. They learned how stone wanted to split, how sand could be made slippery, and how an idea could be phased into a structure. In the next chapter, we go to the human heart of that conversation, to the quarries, the crews, and the daily rhythms of the men and women who made each block a small act of invention.
For generations, popular imagination cast the builders of Egypt's pyramids as anonymous slaves, driven by whips, a dramatic image drawn from ancient hearsay and amplified by modern spectacle. Archaeology over the last half-century has replaced that myth with evidence of a complex, organized labor system made up of skilled craftsmen, seasonal corvée workers, and semi-permanent communities who were provisioned, housed, and buried with care. This is not a story of faceless coercion, but of human labor organized by a state that both demanded service and invested in sustaining it. The most persuasive evidence comes not from a single monument, but from the living architecture that clustered near pyramid sites: purpose-built settlements, bakeries, workshops, storerooms, and cemeteries. At Giza, excavations of the so-called workers' village, Hayt el-Garab, revealed well-planned housing, communal ovens, and specialized work areas, indicating long-term occupation by people who maintained the plateau's monuments. These finds show provisioning at scale: large bread molds, animal bone deposits, and evidence for organized food production consistent with wages in kind and state provisioning rather than ad hoc or purely forced labor. Documentary papyri have shifted the debate from plausible theory to concrete logistics. The Diary of Merer, a set of Old Kingdom logbooks discovered at Wadi el-Jarf, records daily tasks of Merer and his crew transporting Tura limestone to the Giza Plateau in the reign of Khufu. These accounts name crews, describe round trips, and tally stone deliveries, a working record that confirms organized teams, river transport, and schedule-driven work, all under administrative oversight. The papyri show labor organized into teams with distinct responsibilities, not anonymous masses. Burial practices further undermine the slave narrative. In the 1990s and early 2000s, archaeologists found burial grounds near the Giza pyramids whose graves were carefully arranged and sometimes marked with inscriptions. These cemeteries included individuals buried with personal goods and occupational markers, and the skeletons often show signs of healed injuries, evidence that people received care and lived in communities long enough to recover from wounds. Such material culture signifies social recognition and a degree of investment by the broader community or state, inconsistent with a disposable slave workforce. The social structure of pyramid labor appears to have layers.
At the base were local peasants who, according to administrative practices known from later texts, provided seasonal labor during the Nile's inundation when agricultural duties paused. Above them were skilled craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, rope makers, sculptors, whose expertise required training and apprenticeship. Between these groups were foremen, scribes, and provisioning officers who coordinated supplies, recorded work, and ensured quality. This pyramid of labor reflected social roles rather than a binary of free versus slave. Archaeological traces reveal how this division of labor functioned day to day. Workshops adjacent to pyramid complexes contained tool debris, chisel marks, and offcuts, indicating continuous production. Close to these workshops, archaeologists have uncovered bakeries with dozens of ovens and bread molds capable of producing large daily rations. The scale of food production, combined with stable housing, suggests an economy of provisioning, food, shelter, and possibly small payments that allowed large teams to remain productive over extended campaigns. That economic support, in turn, required bureaucracy, storerooms, administrative rooms, and scribal activity visible in the archaeological record. The workforce was not a homogeneous mass. It included specialized units, often named by their supervisors or locales. Inscriptions and later administrative documents identify crews by function or region, and experimental archaeology aligns these groupings with practical tasks. Rope teams for hauling, stone-cutting gangs for shaping, boat crews for river transport. The Diary of Merer, for instance, lists specific crews and boats, implying a system where each team had a steady role and chain of command. This kind of organization allowed the state to coordinate complex, multi-step operations that spanned quarries, rivers, and work sites. Health and medical care are often overlooked, but are crucial evidence of social investment. Skeletal remains from worker cemeteries show healed fractures and signs of long-term survival after serious injuries. In several cases, archaeologists have identified individuals who lived long after severe trauma, a pattern that implies access to care and social support. While the exact nature of medical services in the Old Kingdom is still a matter of research, later textual evidence and the archaeological record suggest organized provisions for treatment and recuperation at major building projects. That investment contradicts the idea that workers were expendable.
Recognizing the workforce's humanity requires us to understand motivation. Service on royal monuments tied into networks of reciprocity and status. Working on a pharaonic project could confer access to rations, social prestige, and connection to a sacred enterprise that promised communal and spiritual rewards. For many, participation was a right of duty embedded in a worldview where contributing to the king's afterlife had religious significance. This blend of obligation, compensation, and belief gave the work both material and moral meaning. The evidence also points to mobility and career paths. Skilled workers could move between sites, following demand for specialized labor. Archaeological indicators, pottery styles, tool types, and burial practices reveal networks of exchange and movement across the Nile Valley. Craftspeople's skills were portable. A trained mason could find work at different royal projects and potentially accumulate status and material benefits over a career. That mobility contrasts sharply with the stagnation implied by slave labor narratives. Gendered divisions of labor are also visible. While heavy stone moving and quarrying were male-dominated, other crucial tasks, baking, brewing, textile production, and domestic provisioning were often performed by women. Pottery, food preparation, and textile fragments near worker settlements point to women's contribution to the logistical backbone of construction. Their labor was essential and continuous, even if less visible in the monumental record. Recognizing these roles broadens our image of the workforce beyond chisels and sledges to include the domestic economies that sustained large teams. Payment structures in the Old Kingdom were complex and often took the form of rations or in-kind wages rather than universal coinage. Workers received bread,
beer, clothing, and occasionally land allocations or exemptions. Archaeologists infer from the scale of provisioning and from occasional written records that such compensations were standardized enough to support seasonal mobilization and longer-term retention of skilled labor. The existence of large, centralized bakeries and storage facilities reinforces the view that labor was remunerated in measurable, organized ways. The role of ideology should not be underestimated. Building a king's tomb was a ritual act as much as a technical one. Participation in the construction was framed within religious language, contributing to the maintenance of Ma'at, or cosmic order, securing the king's rebirth, and ensuring the community's prosperity. This ritual framing provided a cultural incentive to serve and to accept the occasional hardships of large-scale construction. In that context, work for the king was not purely economic compulsion, but a socially embedded practice with moral overtones. Archaeology also uncovers administrative sophistication. Scribal spaces, ceilings, registries, and marked storage rooms indicate systems for allocating resources and recording deliveries. The Mera papyri provide a rare direct glimpse of a transport bureaucracy. On site, storage galleries and administrative niches corroborate that goods were tallied, warehoused, and distributed. These records are not incidental. They were the lifeblood that turned tools and hands into a coordinated construction machine. Importantly, acknowledging that the workforce was not enslaved does not romanticize their conditions. Work was hard, dangerous, and hierarchical. Mortality rates could be high for heavy laborers, seasonal demands disrupted family life, and oversight by foremen could be strict. But historical nuance matters. Exploitation does not equal slavery. And organized state labor with provisioning and recognition is different from the chattel slavery imagined by ancient Greek sources and later dramatizations. The archaeological record lets us be precise about what happened and what did not. The discovery of named tombs and inscriptions linked to overseers and skilled workers also reshapes authorship. Some of the craftspeople and administrators who worked on monumental projects earned titles and memorials. Their tombs sometimes sit close to royal structures, suggesting social mobility for those who rose within the system. These memorials are reminders that monumental architecture is both a public act and a network of recognized expertise. Hundreds and sometimes thousands of people whose identities could be recorded and remembered locally, even if not celebrated in royal inscriptions. Experimental archaeology and ethnographic analogy complement the dead's testimony. Reconstructed bakeries, replicated sledges, and rope-pulling trials give modern scholars practical estimates of crew sizes, food requirements, and the rhythms of labor. These experiments align with archaeological provisioning evidence and with records like the Mera papyri, producing a convergent, testable model of how large teams could have worked efficiently without needing to be slaves in the classic sense. Remembering the hidden workforce is an ethical act. Stones last, people do not. The step pyramid and its successors enshrine royal names, but the food ovens, the worker cemeteries, the broken tools, and the scratched graffiti speak to lives of skill, sacrifice, and social ties. When we read these traces correctly, with nuance and evidence, we honor the real builders, men and women organized by a state, motivated by faith, livelihood, and sometimes ambition. People who turned ritual into architecture and whose labor became the literal bedrock of ancient Egyptian memory. As we leave the workforce's settlements behind, the next chapter will lead us to the raw materials birth, the quarries. There we will watch stone freed from the earth, meet the quarry crews whose skills shaped blocks at source, and follow those blocks on their long river journeys towards the sites where entire communities turned labor into legacy.
The step pyramid rose from an idea not only about power and permanence, but about the very architecture of belief. For ancient Egyptians, death was not an end, but a series of transitions, a reconfiguration of social identity that required ritual infrastructure, the tomb, the cult, the offerings, and the rites that bound the living to the dead. The pyramid was therefore never just a tomb, it was a machine for survival in the afterlife, a public, stone-made contract between king and cosmos that demanded continuous care. Central to that contract were layered notions of the person, the ka, the ba, and the akh. The ka, often translated simply as life force, needed a place to dwell. It required offerings, a name, and a stable address in the landscape. The ba was that more mobile aspect of personality that could move between worlds. The akh was the transformed, effective spirit achieved after proper funerary rites. Together, these concepts created a theological imperative. A king's body must be preserved, his name must be spoken, and rituals must be performed so the ka could receive sustenance and the akh could participate in the god's order. The pyramid was therefore never just a tomb, it was a machine for survival in the afterlife, a public, stone-made contract between king and cosmos that demanded continuous care. Ritual practice was structured and perpetual. Mortuary cults were not occasional observances, they were sustained programs of offerings, recitations, and ceremonies performed by priests, officials, and attendants whose work resembled a permanent ministry. The mortuary temple and its subsidiary chapels played host to daily offerings, bread, beer, incense, and symbolic goods intended to feed the king's ka. These rites were material acts, food placed on altars, libations poured, and spells recited, all to maintain the relationship between living order and the king's eternal well-being. Fear was an equal and balancing force. In a world where cosmic order, Maat, held social life together, any failure to perform the appropriate rites risked disrupting equilibrium. For rulers, the stakes were existential. Failure to secure the afterlife could mean the loss of divine favor, a breakdown in fertility, or political instability. For the workforce, the fear was practical and immediate. A ritual mistake could render the tomb ineffective, negating years of labor and threatening social shame for those who had invested their craft. Thus, faith and fear merged into a discipline. Meticulous ritual performance justified monumental labor. The architecture itself encoded ritual prescriptions. Orientation, alignment, and spatial sequencing mattered because religious cosmology was spatial. West for the land of the dead, processional axes that reenacted sacred journeys, and chapels aligned to manage viewer sightlines and ritual flow. The step pyramid's courtyards, false doors, and serdab chambers were not decorative but functional in a theological schema. They provided settings for offerings, housed statues that could receive the ka, and mediated between the visible world and subterranean burial spaces. Stone became scripture. Rituals that sustained the dead required people skilled in liturgy and craft. High priests and temple personnel managed festivals, recited spells, and performed the daily cult. Priests wore ritual garments, maintained ritual equipment, and supervised offerings. Scribes recorded donations and managed temple economies. Their work turned the pyramid from a static object into an active center of worship. This professionalization of ritual is visible in architecture. Rooms arranged for priests, storage galleries for cult goods, and workshops producing votive objects and ritual paraphernalia. The sacred was a labor-intensive industry.
The Hebsed festival, a ritual of renewal, illuminates how religion fused political survival with festive performance. Originally a jubilee marking decades of rule, the Hebsed involved ritual runs, symbolic rejuvenation, and public affirmation of kingship. For a ruler whose afterlife depended on ritual continuity, ceremonies like the Hebsed underscored both physical vitality and divine legitimacy. They were demonstrations that the pharaoh remained capable of upholding Maat.
Such rites reinforced the link between ritual performance and political continuity, tying public spectacle to the theological needs of the mortuary cult. The living city of the mortuary complex made these rituals possible. Offerings had to be prepared, stored, and moved. Priests had to be provisioned. Statues had to be maintained. Bakers, brewers, potters, and weavers produced the daily goods that fed cult images and ancient palates alike. The choreography of ritual therefore extended beyond the temple. It included the ovens that baked ritual loaves, the vats that brewed cult beer, and the storerooms that kept supplies fresh. Faith created industry. Industry sustained faith. The idea that ritual practice could guarantee a pharaoh's posthumous power motivated enormous investment in time and resources. The step pyramid's durable casing and careful orientation were technologies of certainty. Stone that would not erode as mud brick did, alignments that anchored memory, and spaces built to facilitate perpetual rites. In this sense, the pyramid was a technological solution to theological anxiety, an attempt to minimize uncertainty about whether the king's cob would be fed for centuries to come. But ritual also carried social narratives. Funerary rituals reaffirmed social hierarchies. They reasserted the pharaoh's centrality, staged elite identities, and enacted cosmological stories for the populace. The scenes carved within tombs and the formulas recited by priests taught society how order worked. The king as mediator, the gods as guarantors, and the people as participants in a divinely ordered world. This pedagogic function made mortuary architecture a medium of ideological education. The emotional life of ritual must not be overlooked. For those who labored on the pyramid, craftsmen, priests, and provisioners, rites could be sources of meaning and solace. Participating in the king's cult linked individuals to a grand narrative that promised communal stability and cosmic favor. For many, contributing to the mortuary cult was both a duty and an honor. It offered a stake in the sacred economy and, in some cases, social prestige. The sacred and the personal were intertwined. Yet the fear side remained potent. The Egyptian worldview emphasized correct speech and right action. Ritual mistakes, mispronounced spells, improper offerings, wrongly placed objects could render a tomb powerless. That fear demanded redundancy. Multiple copies of spells, carefully prepared offering lists, and elaborate ritual sequences repeated over and over. The aim was to saturate the tomb in ritual insurance, materially and ritually hedging against cosmic failure. The architecture, the texts, and the ritual technicians together produced redundancy as a religious strategy. The funerary texts, later formalized into the pyramid texts of the 5th and 6th dynasties, show a developing theological vocabulary that clarifies these anxieties. While the most extensive pyramid texts come after Djoser's era, the underlying ideas, transformation, nourishment, and divine ascent, were already present in Old Kingdom ritual practice. These texts later made explicit the metaphysical steps the king had to take. In earlier times, the architecture and cult actions carried much of that meaning. The pyramid texts would codify what generations of ritual practice had already enacted. The step pyramid's design also institutionalized memory. Inscribed names, offering lists, and designed sight lines kept the king's identity present. Ritual served as a mnemonic technology. Repeated ceremonies and visible offerings preserved a name in the social record. In a culture where the spoken name conferred existence in the afterlife, architectural features that made offering and remembrance easy were indispensable. Stone, then, functioned as a mnemonic device that made remembrance materially unavoidable.
The theological urgency behind pyramid building produced practical systems for continuity. Priestly families tended cults across generations. Endowment estates provided goods for rituals, and temple administrations maintained storerooms, archives, and legal mechanisms to ensure offerings continued. These institutional arrangements were as vital as the stones themselves. Without economic and administrative continuity, rituals would lapse, and the pyramid's purpose would fail. The mortuary complex was therefore both a religious center and an administrative enterprise. The interplay of spectacle and secrecy also shaped ritual design. Public festivals displayed royal authority. Inner sancta, hidden chambers, and sealed burial spaces maintained mystery. The public saw processions and offerings. The inner rites, the magical acts meant to empower the king, occurred behind closed doors. That tension between display and concealed ritual mirrored the pharaoh's dual role as a public sovereign and a liminal, semi-divine figure who navigated between worlds. Architecture choreographed both exposure and esoteric performance. Over time, religio-political anxieties about continuity shaped architectural innovation. The shift from perishable materials to durable stone, the elaboration of mortuary precincts, and the institutionalization of temple endowments all responded to the same impulse: to secure the king's afterlife against time, theft, and neglect. The pyramid is therefore readable as a cultural technology, a set of practices and forms designed to keep belief operative across generations. But the heartbeat of faith and fear was not a monolith. It varied by context and era. Local traditions, regional cults, and political shifts altered emphasis and practice. What remained constant was the principle that ritual sustenance and correct procedure were non-negotiable. The material investments at Saqqara represent a particular solution to universal human anxieties about mortality and memory. A culturally specific answer to the question, how do we keep someone present after they are gone? As modern viewers, we can mistake ritual acts for superstition, but in their historical context, they were technologies of social cohesion. Ritual-bound communities mobilized labor and institutionalized economic flows. The belief that offerings mattered created a steady demand that justified provisioning systems. The fear of ritual failure produced redundancy and record-keeping. In short, religion at Saqqara organized time, labor, and administrative creativity in ways that made monumental architecture both meaningful and sustainable. The step pyramid at Saqqara was not a one-off miracle. It was an architectural seed, a new language whose grammar would be learned, revised, and perfected across generations. From the layered mastaba stacks of Djoser's reign to the soaring, smooth faces of Khufu's Great Pyramid, a clear line of technical and ideological inheritance runs through the 3rd and 4th dynasties. This is the story of how an architectural experiment matured into an entire epoch, the Pyramid Age. Djoser's monument, dated to the late 27th century BCE, established crucial precedents: construction in dressed stone, comprehensively planned mortuary complexes, and an integrated ritual landscape that combined tomb, temple, and procession. Imhotep's solutions, stacking mastaba-like volumes, crafting ceremonial courts, and orchestrating logistics, demonstrated that stone could be used as both structural and symbolic language. That breakthrough set a technical expectation. If permanence was the goal, then stone would be the material of choice. The immediate successors to Djoser inherited both the monuments and the institutional capacity needed to attempt even bolder building programs. Over the later 3rd dynasty and into the 4th, The royal court consolidated control over quarries, riverine transport, and labor management in ways that made larger, more ambitious pyramids possible. The transition was therefore not merely architectural, it was administrative and economic, the expansion of a state capable of sustaining multi-decade construction agendas. The Fourth Dynasty, beginning around the late 27th to early 26th century BCE, marks the period when architects pushed the step pyramids idea toward a true pyramid, a smooth-sided monolithic silhouette. The key figure here is Sneferu, whose experiments at Medum and Dashur show an iterative problem-solving approach to scale and stability. Sneferu's building program reveals an engineering culture willing to learn hard lessons in public. Medum provides an early case in point. The structure at Medum began life as a step pyramid and was later transformed into a true pyramid by filling and recasing. The process apparently produced structural instability. Parts of Medum later collapsed, creating the collapsed pyramid visage we see today. That apparent failure was a practical experiment in translating stepped geometry into a single continuous slope, a conversion whose risks and lessons shaped later design decisions. At Dashur, Sneferu tried again, learning from Medum's deficiencies. The bent pyramid, so called because its slope changes about halfway up, is widely interpreted as an on-site correction. The builders initially set a steep angle, around 52 degrees, and later reduced it to about 43.5 degrees to avoid instability as the monument rose. That change is the archaeological equivalent of a design review mid-construction, evidence of empirical engineering rather than miraculous perfection. Sneferu's second major success, the Red Pyramid at Dashur, demonstrates the payoff of those lessons. Built at a gentler slope and with improved understanding of core construction and casing, the Red Pyramid stands as perhaps the first true, successful smooth-sided pyramid. Its completion signaled that the combination of materials, ramp strategies, and organizational logistics could be coordinated to produce a stable, enduring form. The Red Pyramid thus marks a technical maturation from experiment to repeatable technique. The movement from step to smooth sides also reflects evolving aesthetic and ideological requirements. Smooth faces read differently in the landscape. They present a clear, singular icon intended to dominate sightlines and embody the pharaoh's eternal horizon. This new silhouette carried theological meaning: the sun's rays, the horizon motif, Akhet, and a streamlined symbolism of ascent and divine rebirth. In short, form and belief continued to shape one another. Administrative sophistication kept pace with architectural ambition. Rigid provisioning systems, canal construction, and riverine logistics became essential. The Diary of Merer, papyri discovered at Wali al-Jarf, gives rare documentary proof of these supply chains in action during the Fourth Dynasty. The logbooks describe the transportation of Tura limestone by boat to the Giza Plateau for casing stones, listing crews, trips, and schedules. These records transform scholarly inference into documented practice. Pyramid projects depended on long-distance material procurement and coordinated maritime operations. This growing logistical network allowed rulers to exploit specialized stone sources: local limestone for bulk cores, the fine white limestone of Tura for casings, and Aswan granite for structural elements. Each material had a role defined by its mechanical and aesthetic properties: massive local blocks for mass and stability, fine Tura casing for a smooth, reflective skin, and granite for areas requiring compressive strength. Understanding and managing these supply chains was as critical as mastering tools on the worksite. Khufu, whose reign in the early 26th century BCE is commonly dated to roughly the 2580s to 2560s BCE, built on Sneferu's experiments and state capacity. The Great Pyramid at Giza is both an architectural culmination and a logistical triumph, an enterprise that required tens of thousands of workers, organized fleet operations, and decades of continuous administration. Its sheer scale tests every element of the evolved system: quarrying, transport, surveying, and workforce provisioning. The Great Pyramid's precision, measured alignment to true north, remarkably flat casing planes in its original state, and tightly fitted joints reveals advances in surveying and quality control. Simple tools, plumb bobs, sighting rods, water levels, used by disciplined teams could and did achieve extraordinary results through careful execution and iterative checking. The Great Pyramid shows the cumulative effect of centuries of craft refinement and administrative discipline.
Structural choices at Giza also demonstrate evolved engineering logic. Builders deployed a massive core of rough blocks, stabilized by packing and infill, then used fine casing stones to create the exterior geometry. Internal chambers used granite set in ways that managed compressive forces. Relieving chambers and offset vaults above the king's chamber show an understanding of load distribution. These solutions indicate that by Khufu's time, architects were not improvising, but applying tested structural concepts at an unprecedented scale. Yet the Great Pyramid was not a single triumph, but part of a broader architectural program that included subsidiary pyramids, mortuary temples, workers' villages, and causeways. The complex at Giza functioned as an integrated ritual industrial hub. Quarries, harbor facilities, workshops, and provisioning centers all linked into a unified project. The administrative depth needed to sustain Giza for decades is one of the clearest signs that the Old Kingdom had developed a robust state apparatus capable of multi-layered, long-term projects. The human story behind these monuments also evolved. As techniques standardized, so did the labor organization. Specialized crews, named work gangs, and documented supply lines appear in both archaeology and texts. The Diary of Merer, for example, mentions named crews and overseers, revealing a workforce structured by roles and accountability rather than amorphous mass. The workforce's increasing specialization and semi-permanence are prerequisites for the scaled projects of the Fourth Dynasty. Intellectual continuity mattered too. Knowledge transfer across generations through apprenticeships, administrative records, and architectural practice allowed later teams to benefit from earlier experiments. Lessons from Meidum's collapse and the Bent Pyramid's correction informed the choices at Dashur's Red Pyramid and Giza. That continuity suggests an institutional memory. Scribes and master builders remembered what worked and what did not, refining procedures and codifying best practices. The social meanings of pyramids also deepened. By the Fourth Dynasty, pyramids functioned as national symbols. They anchored royal ideology, projected state power into the landscape, and structured ritual economies that supported priesthoods and local elites. The scale and visibility of the Giza complex transformed the idea of the pyramid from a royal tomb into a cultural emblem, a monument designed to be read across time and territory. Yet the technical evolution did not make pyramid building less costly or contentious. Projects still demanded resource allocation that could strain regional economies, redirect manpower, and concentrate wealth. Balancing ritual imperatives with practical constraints remained an administrative challenge. How to sustain feeding, housing, and organizing tens of thousands of workers for decades without destabilizing broader society. The Old Kingdom's institutions managed this balance, but the cost of maintaining such a system was part of what later scholars point to when they discuss the political vulnerabilities of a state anchored to monumental expenditure. The legacy of the step pyramid, then, is both technological and cultural. Technically, it began a sequence of experiments in materials, geometry, and logistics that culminated at Giza.
Culturally, it inaugurated the pyramid as an icon and visible program of kingship and afterlife ideology that successive rulers replicated and amplified. Where Djoser began an architectural revolution in stone, Sneferu and Khufu refined and popularized its most durable forms. Importantly, the evolutionary narrative counters simplistic stories of linear progress. The path from step to smooth sides was iterative, messy, and empirically grounded. Collapses, reworkings, and mid-construction design changes are visible in the archaeological record and show that ancient builders were adaptive engineers. Their triumphs were the product of trial, correction, and institutional learning, a slow accretion of competence rather than a single triumphant flash. The birth of legacy is also a story of attribution and memory. Djoser's name is preserved with Imhotep as architect. Sneferu's experimentation and Khufu's monumental achievement carried their names into eternity. Yet the broader legacy rests on thousands of unnamed hands, the quarrymen, masons, boatmen, bakers, and scribes, whose labor and skill turned experiments into enduring monuments. The pyramids memorialize rulers, but their making memorializes whole societies, technical cultures that learned how to make permanence in an impermanent world. Stone remembers in a way people do not. The step pyramid still reads across the Saqqara plain, an argument in limestone for permanence. But the faces of the many who built it have largely been erased by the same forces that polished the pyramid's casing: wind, reuse of materials, and the slow folding of centuries into dust. The silence of time is not absolute. Archaeology and texts give us hints, but it is deep, and those hints require careful listening. Memory in ancient Egypt favored names of rulers and gods. Lists of kings, royal inscriptions, and monumental titulary ensured that pharaohs, Djoser among them, would be remembered. This selective memory was deliberate. The state's rituals and records were instruments of commemoration designed to keep a king's name spoken in perpetuity. For a society that equated being remembered with spiritual survival, royal names occupied a privileged archive. The fate of non-elite lives, however, depended on different, more fragile media: household pottery, uninscribed graves, and the occasional scrap of papyrus. Archaeology shows us where ordinary lives intersected monumental projects. Bakeries, workshops, and worker cemeteries clustered near the great building sites. These traces reveal organized communities, but their material traces are modest and easily lost. Mud brick houses crumble, wooden fences rot, and storage pits fill with sand. When stones get quarried to build later monuments, older structures can vanish entirely. Thus, much of the day-to-day reality of pyramid builders survives only in fragments that require interpretation, context, and cautious reconstruction. Time's silence is also a result of reuse. Later generations quarried ancient monuments to reuse fine stones in new buildings. Casing stones were pried away for new temples and mosques. Over millennia, the original gloss of white Tura limestone that once made pyramids gleam was removed in stages, leaving rough cores and hollowed facades. This practical recycling of high-quality stone has erased tangential information. Inscriptions on inner walls, small architectural features, or artisan graffiti that might once have told us more about the people who shaped those blocks. But silence is misleading if we accept it at face value. It tempts us to imagine blankness where there was density, entire neighborhoods, seasonal caps, and networks of supply. Excavations in the 20th and 21st centuries have rewritten that conceit by revealing worker villages and cemeteries that provide counterpoints to the monumental record. These discoveries show that while many names were lost, the contours of lives, diet, injury patterns, household size, and mobility can be read from the residues left behind. Through careful science, silence becomes a text we can learn to read. Consider the worker settlement at Giza, Hayt el Ghurab. Excavations there revealed planned housing, large communal bakeries, and feeding installations, strongly implying sustained and organized provisioning of laborers. The scale of food production and the arrangement of work areas show a community built to support massive construction. Though individual names rarely survive, the settlement's material record provides a human geography of labor, where people lived, what they ate, and how work was organized. Such sites convert absence into structural evidence of social life. Documentary fragments sometimes pierce the general hush. The Diary of Merer, a set of Old Kingdom papyri recovered at Wadi al-Jarf, gives a rare first-hand administrative glimpse into the logistics of pyramid building during Khufu's reign. Merer's logbooks describe timbered boats, named teams, and round trips hauling Tura limestone, concrete traces of a functioning transport economy. These papyri are precious precisely because they are exceptions, direct voices from the past that confirm the organizational depth behind monumental works. Yet even with such finds, historians face subtractions. Papyri are fragmentary, inscriptions selective, and the archaeological record incomplete. The silence of time often results in overrepresentation of the extraordinary and underrepresentation of the ordinary. This bias pushes narratives toward kings and wonders because those left the most durable marks. To correct that tilt, archaeologists excavate the margins, the ovens, the refuse pits, and the modest graves where everyday life accumulated evidence in manageable amounts. Those margins progressively amplify the quiet voices ordinary sources left behind. Human remains are an essential counterpoint to monument-centered histories. Skeletal analyses reveal work patterns, injuries, and health profiles. Studies of cemetery populations associated with work settlements show healed fractures, signs of repetitive stress, and dietary signals consistent with a life of heavy labor, but also with care. Healed injuries indicate recovery and support rather than immediate disposal. Such osteological records complicate easy narratives of disposable slave labor and instead point to communities with social investment in their members.
Even where direct names are missing, social identities sometimes survive in other forms. Tombs of overseers, stelae of foremen, and small memorials occur near royal complexes and provide glimpses of those who administered labor. These markers suggest that skilled work and administrative competence could earn recognition and memorialization, not in the scale reserved for pharaohs, but in ways that ensured local remembrance. The built landscape thus encoded multiple calendars of memory, one imperial and public, the other local and private. The silence also conceals stories of mobility, pottery styles, isotopic analyses of teeth and bone, and tool typologies show that craftsmen and laborers often traveled for work, following seasonal demand or recruitment drives. Some workers were local, others came from distant nomes. This mobility created networks of craft knowledge and social ties that transcended single sites. The pyramid projects were therefore not isolated endeavors, but nodes in a Nile-wide system of labor exchange and expertise. Time's erasure is not strictly chronological, it is political. New dynasties reinterpreted the past, sometimes intentionally erasing or repurposing the monuments of predecessors. Shifts in religious practice, economic collapse, or political fragmentation altered who cared for which cults and which monuments received ongoing provisioning. When a mortuary cult lapsed, the structures that once sustained memory, Priesthoods, storehouses, and endowments dwindled, and the material infrastructure for remembering unraveled. Thus, the silence often reflects historical change as much as mere passage of years. Even so, silence can be generative. The archaeological practice of reading absence, understanding what would be present if certain institutions existed, is a powerful method. For example, the lack of extensive royal household records for some early periods is itself evidence. It points scholars to the likelihood that oral administration, decentralized provisioning, or material practices like perishable record-keeping played more prominent roles. By analyzing gaps critically, historians infer organizational forms that left smaller physical footprints. The silence of time also raises ethical questions about representation. Who gets to be remembered in public histories? The monuments privilege elites, yet modern scholarship increasingly centers the lives of workers, their families, and the administrators who coordinated them. Reconfiguring narrative priorities requires careful evidence and humility, avoiding projection, resisting romanticization, and acknowledging the limits of what the material record can prove. It also requires creativity in using multiple lines of evidence, archaeology, texts, osteology, and experimental replication to reconstruct plausible, well-grounded human stories. The silent voices occasionally speak through small gestures, a graffiti mark on an inner wall, a name scratched behind the casing stone, or a token left in a niche. These minor traces are potent because they humanize the vast enterprise. A worker's handprint, a tally scratched on a pot, or a votive left near a work area transforms abstraction into personhood. Each tiny mark stands as a refutation of total silence. Ordinary people left enough crumbs for careful readers to follow. Technology is changing how we listen. Remote sensing, LiDAR, and geophysical surveys reveal buried features without full excavation. Isotopic analysis maps ancient diets and migration. Microbotanical studies reconstruct plant use in provisioning, and paleopathology reconstructs lived bodies in detail. Combined with archival finds like Merer's diary, these methods turn fragmentary evidence into robust reconstructions and let us hear more of what time muffled. Modern science is not filling silence with certainty. It is amplifying previously inaudible patterns and making interpretation more defensible. Yet science also reminds us of limits. New methods can refine dates, map routes, and estimate crew sizes, but they cannot conjure names where none were recorded. They cannot retrieve private conversations or recover every lost face. Part of the historian's craft is therefore to balance narrative aspiration with evidentiary restraint, to tell human stories grounded in data without claiming the absolute intimacy of those who lived them. That restraint honors the silence, rather than inventing voices where none can be justified. There is a moral dimension to the silence's recovery. When archaeology returns dignity to the ordinary, when a worker's grave is documented, analyzed, and interpreted, it rebalances who counts in the historical record. Recognizing healed fractures, household arrangements, and food economies makes visible the recurring truth. Monumental history rests on everyday lives. Telling that story is not merely academic, it is a form of acknowledgement for those who shaped history with hands and sweat rather than inscriptions. The silence of time is therefore ambivalent. It is a loss of names, of details, of the full resonance of lived human experience. But it is also a space where disciplined inquiry can work, where fragments can be assembled into living pictures, and where modern listeners can practice attentive reconstruction. The monuments remain central because they are durable, but the human story grows richer when we read the margins, trace supply chains, analyze bones, and follow papyrus lines that log the movement of stone. Together, these sources let us tune in to a chorus of otherwise faint voices. As we stand beside a simple worker's grave, a pottery shard cupped in hand, and wind moving over the step pyramid, we confront time's double action. It hides and preserves. It erases names, but also compresses meaning into artifacts that survive by accident and design. The challenge is to listen carefully, to combine evidence across disciplines, and tell stories that honor both the grandeur of stone and the fragility of lives that made it.
Stones outlast people, but they also speak in seams, chips, and the faint scratches of a mason's hand. The step pyramid remains a visible echo, an architectural argument for permanence that still shapes the horizon above Saqqara. Yet beneath that durable face lie fragile traces of the thousands who made it, lives recorded not by grand inscriptions, but by ovens, shelters, healed bones, and the occasional scratched tally. These fragments are how the builders asked to be remembered. Remembering them requires combining many kinds of evidence. Administrative papyri, like the Diary of Merer, give us the logistics, named crews, boat movements, and schedules that connected quarries to pyramids, and proved that building was an organized enterprise, not chaotic labor. Archaeological finds at worker settlements and cemeteries reveal the human side: well-laid houses, large bakeries, and burials showing healed injuries and repeated care. Together, these sources transform anonymous mass into community. People who ate, healed, and were themselves memorialized in modest ways. The architectural memory, the pyramid itself, also shaped how later generations remembered craftsmanship. Imhotep and Djoser appear in the record as named innovators, but the monuments were realized by complex social systems: quarry teams, masons, rope makers, carpenters, priests, and scribes who coordinated provisioning and ritual. Their names are seldom grandly enshrined, but their methods and choices survive in the stone record. The phased construction, the dressing marks, and the logistics visible in spoil heaps and canals. The pyramid bears their signature in technique, if not in text. Recovering these human stories is an ethical as well as an intellectual act. Osteological analyses that show healed fractures and long survival after injury reveal communities that cared for their own. Evidence that undercuts sensational claims of disposable slave labor and instead points to organized provisioning and medical attention. Worker towns reveal social organization, food production, seasonal rhythms, and the institutional frameworks that sustained multi-decade projects. Every shard, oven, and grave makes a case for remembering labor as central to legacy. Memory is also shaped by loss. Over centuries, medieval quarrying, environmental erosion, and changing cultic practices removed casing stones and erased incidental inscriptions. What remains is a curated past. Rulers' names preserved because the state designed their immortality. Ordinary names muted because they depended on perishable media. That imbalance calls for deliberate recovery, excavating margins, reading refuse, and listening to the small traces that reconstruct lives otherwise silenced. Today, new methods deepen our hearing. Remote sensing, isotopic analysis, and archival papyri work in concert to amplify faint voices. When a logbook records a boat run, an oven's footprint explains daily rations. When a skeleton shows healed trauma, it tells of care and community. These converging lines produce a richer, more humane history, one that credits the millions of hands that turned an idea into stone. The stones will continue to outlast us, but how we tell their story matters. If the pyramid's echo reaches us only as a monument to kings, we inherit a partial past. If we listen instead for the measured rhythms of work, the pragmatic footprints of provision, and the delicate traces of healed bodies, we recover a fuller truth, that eternity was built by human lives, skilled, organized, and often unnamed. To remember them is to complete the monument's purpose, not only to preserve a name, but to honor the community that made that name possible. As the sun slides along the stones, consider this small act of remembrance. Next time you stand before ancient architecture, look closer for the human economy embedded in it. The ovens, the alleys, the burial mounds. Share what you find with others. Support careful research that listens to marginal voices. And tell the stories of those who built our monuments with hands, skill, and faith. Their echo is still faintly audible, and it deserves our attention.